So I want to welcome everyone today for joining us on Monday. May it be like myself, where I'm having my morning coffee, maybe it's lunch, or maybe you're just wrapping up the day. I just want to say thank you for joining us. Today, our webinar is called Measuring the Machines. So in today's panel, we'll be focusing on defining and discussing what decision-grade artificial intelligence AI evidence means in the life sciences. We feel that the question is no longer whether generative AI belongs in life science workflows. Instead, it's whether it can be trusted when the stakes are real. Today, we're not looking to litigate whether AI should be used. Instead, our goal is to bring diverse perspectives together to highlight what is important for each of our stakeholders that are involved with the use of AI in life sciences and how we can better align on what acceptable performance actually means in life science decision-making. So a quick overview about Reliant AI, who is hosting our webinar today. Go next slide. So today we'll just do a quick welcome. I'll introduce our panelists, give a Reliant overview, and then we'll jump into our conversation. As Ariana has put in the chat, we really value questions. So if you have any, please use that chat feature to add in those questions. At the end, we'll wrap up with just a little bit about what we're working on at Reliant. All right, next slide, please. So Reliant is a Montreal-based startup that provides AI-powered research and intelligence tools to help life science teams make high-confidence commercial and clinical decisions faster with greater accuracy. Reliant is a seed-stage funded startup that was founded in 2023. Our team includes world-class machine learning engineers, one of them we have today, and a number of life science professionals with over 150 scientific publications, 13 US patents, and over 25 plus years of pharma and life science experience. Now, looking towards our conversation today, my name is Breland Smiechowski. I am an epidemiologist, educator, and life science strategist with about 14 years plus now of experience working at the intersection of data, health, and artificial intelligence machine learning in the life sciences space. I'm a strategic engagement manager here at Reliant, where I partner with both our customers and our incredible internal teams to make products that are intentional and drive value. Beyond my role here at Reliant, I also am an adjunct lecturer at the University of Southern California. Today, I am joined by three incredible panelists: a chief medical officer, a life science evidence leader, and a machine learning research scientist, who all bring different, diverse, and valuable perspectives and experiences to our conversations. First off, I have Dr. Faisal Medmun, is the Chief Medical Officer at Medicus Pharma. Their NASDAQ listing is MDCX, and is a global pharmaceutical executive with more than 20 years experience in clinical development, medical affairs, and drug safety across oncology, rare diseases, and specialty medicine. He has held senior leadership roles at Pfizer, Bristol Myers Squibb, GSK, Sanofi, and has worked across the UK, France, and the United States. Next, I have Dr. Song Wang, who is a Takeda leader in global and regional evidence generation with over 15 years of experience in health economics outcome research, HEOR, real-world evidence, RWE, and new product planning. Song has built functional structures, strengthened local evidence generation capabilities, and fostered partnerships that advance portfolios across global, regional, and local markets. And then finally, we have Dr. Marc Bellemare, who is our Chief Scientific Officer and one of the co-founders of Reliant AI. He is also an adjunct professor at McGill University, University of Montreal, and is the Canada CFAR AI Chair at MILA. His research focuses on deep reinforcement learning and generative models, and includes the development of the Atari 2600 as a benchmark for general intelligence and the first commercial application of reinforcement learning to stratospheric flight. He's one of DeepMind's early research scientists and previously led a research team at Google Brain. So thank you all for joining us here. I'm really excited about this conversation. Really where we want to start out is we know that life science teams are being asked and are asking others to trust AI-generated evidence in decisions that matter. And we all know those stakes are high. When a model gets something wrong in our space, we know that could lead to a failed trial, It could mean a mispriced asset or a clinical decision on evidence that never captured the full complexity of the actual landscape. So I'm curious across you, and maybe we start with you, Faisal, is what does a decision grade actually mean in your world? And what do you think, what do you think about that when you're using it to make decisions in the commercial life science space?
Absolutely, and thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. I really appreciate it, and welcome everyone. I suppose from my perspective, there's two aspects to this question. One is a slightly broader question, which is when to make a decision to use generative AI in life sciences. And the second is when we do want to use it, what do we mean by decision grade outputs from that? And I suppose both questions are equally as important. From a first aspect, I think sometimes we can get carried away, especially with the new technology that people are getting familiar with. And we start throwing out older technologies or simpler technologies, which if it wasn't broken, why fix it? And like an old colleague of mine used to say, why use a space shuttle when a taxi can do to solve a certain problem? And we have many, many tools which are tried and tested within life sciences where they work perfectly well. And there may be a marginal or it may be no iterative increment improvement with AI. So we shouldn't really need to tinker with it, at least at first. So I suppose that's the first decision. Second one is when we do want to do something with a novel AI tool or indeed any tool, what I look for is we are not talking about mathematics. We are not talking about something that requires perfection. Medicine is as much of an art as it is a science. And I just need something that is really safe to act under uncertainty. That we're always going to have a level of uncertainty. Any experiment that we run, anything that we want to do is going to have a false positive and a false negative rate. So I know it's not going to be perfect, but just it's safe. It's been demonstrated to be safe enough to act when the stakes are high. And the stakes are high when you're dealing with patients. The stakes are high when you're running a clinical trial program or launching a new medicine. And the stakes are even higher when you're in a biotech running a handful of programs and you've got a handful of shots on goal versus a larger pharma company which can maybe spray gun a little bit more to spread that risk. Contextualization of the evidence is critical, not just aggregating evidence. And we see this across life sciences. Expert opinion is still highly valued by the regulators, which synthesizes the evidence. And having AI to support that synthesis is really, really important. Transparency on what the limitations are. This is not a catch-all. And this is important because there are other tools that we can use to cover those blind spots. We just need to know where those blind spots are. And really alignment on what is being done, what decisions are going to be made on the back of it. So if you've got something which is an output from an AI tool or any tool, can it support a real clinical or commercial decision pathway? And if it can't, it's not decision grade, even no matter how elegant that tool is.
Thank you, Faisal. I like some of the spaceship missions taxi in there, the contextualization. And again, I think you're very true on that the expert opinion, again, is so highly regarded in our field that, again, it's to have evidence to support that. So Song, I'm curious, coming from your background, what does decision grade really mean from your perspective?
Yeah, thanks again for the opportunity, and I fully agree with what Faisal has outlined. And I also like to maybe it's easier job for me to recap, but I'd like to borrow what Cochrane has outlined as the three principles of highest standard or highest quality of evidence, which are rigor, transparency, and replicability. So I think this is also what Faisal has also discussed, and also there's certainly a component of uncertainties around all those three principles. But yeah, to me, decision grade really mean that three principles.
Thank you for sharing, Song, and thank you for bringing that context and conciseness that Cochrane brings. I really appreciate that. And so, Mark, I'm curious from you as the ML expert in the room, when you're thinking about decision grade, for AI, for life science decision making. What does that mean for you?
Absolutely. Um, I think the point about life sciences being complex and messy and in many ways so ambiguous is exactly the right one, right? A lot of the challenge that we face when we think about integrating AI into our workflows today, that's true in life sciences and that's true beyond life sciences, is that they sit, this is a tool that sits at the intersection of software and something different. And we're still trying to find our bearings around what that means exactly, right? If we ask the question, what does it mean for a calculator to be decision grade? And like Song's point is say, well, it better be replicable, right? Every time I ask for 2 plus 2, it gives me 4. And the challenge here is that as we're expecting AI to give answers to much more complicated questions, it's becoming really hard to understand what replicability means in some contexts. And it's becoming really hard also to know, am I aligned with the user in terms of what the assumptions I should be making to answer this question, right? With a calculator, the interface is clear. There's no misalignment. There's no ambiguity as to what question you're asking. So for me, decision grade, the most important thing is that transparency and in many ways embracing the fact that if the question's ambiguous, if the world is ambiguous, we're going to need to do much more than just deliver one answer. And what's very exciting is that we're seeing this emerge in the field today, new techniques for helping users understand this. And then essentially, just like the calculator, just like an Excel spreadsheet, be in support of a decision, but not make the decision completely for the user.
Thank you, Mark. I'd be curious, Song and Faisal, as we kind of build off that. So we're talking about the themes of rigor, transparency, replicability, knowing that we live in sort of a vague world and sometimes a vague space. What specific evidence or methodological transparency, source traceability, or reproducibility are non-negotiable when you're using evidence that are generated by machine learning AI? And also, if you have any thoughts on what either what Mark added in or Song or the other panelists said.
No, absolutely. So I would agree with everything that's been said wholeheartedly. I think we should approach it in a very similar way that we look at any tool or new methodology in life sciences. And so just to reiterate, really important to have source traceability, really important to have reproducibility, and really important to have clinical concordance or coherence in terms of what is being said. So on the source traceability, this is obviously particularly important with AI generation tools because at least a lot of the early iterations had a black box. There was a black box, they didn't know what was in the middle, and that became an issue from how can we trace where this claim is coming from? How would we feel about including something like that in a regulatory dossier or a market access dossier? And how can we then justify if something is missing or goes wrong? To give you a real life example, I was involved in a study where we used a machine learning tool to hyper enrich patients who are at higher risk of having paroxysmal atrial fibrillation. This is atrial fibrillation where they don't have it all the time, this irregular heart murmur, heart arrhythmia. They don't have it all the time, but when they do have it, it really increases the chances of them having a stroke or overall the stroke. And there are some clinical scores that you can do. But when you use those clinical scores, it still has very large swathes of the population and it's too expensive and not scalable to screen them all. So we used a machine learning algorithm to try and enrich those patient populations based on longitudinal data sets within the EMR systems, looking at patterns, trying to enrich them, and using that enriched patient population, screen those patients, and try and demonstrate that that enriched patient population had a high chance of AF and needed to be on prophylactic therapy. You can imagine as we did that, most of the questions we got from the ethics committees is, how can we justify the patient that you didn't include or didn't enrich, and then who weren't screened, or maybe as a byproduct, were then, because we in that EMR system, we try and identify these patients and the other patients were felt to be low risk and got missed. That was a really, really important part of it. And so we had to come up with a lot of things around that. So I think that's really important. Reproducibility, critical, of course, but as we know, no two experiments that you run in life sciences will be the same. It's one of the biggest issues in preclinical. You run two preclinical experiments, you're never going to get the same result, right? There's always going to be variability. Clinical studies, exactly the same. So there is going to be an issue, but we just need to understand if we do get a different result, do you understand why we're getting those different results each time we run it? Very important. And of course, lastly, as I mentioned, clinical concordance or coherence. We don't want to get into the situation where we're saying, well, the data is telling us that this is statistically significant, so that's the end of it. If it doesn't clinically make sense, we need to understand why it's not clinically making sense and kind of build that clinical coherence into it. So I think that is really, really important for me to see as we decide what to bring on, what to apply, and where to take those risks.
Would it be fair, Faisal, to say that explainability is really important across the board? So very much knowing what it is, what it isn't. If it is not, we're not seeing exactly the same result, why that is. If there's gaps, why that is.
Exactly.
And just more, I think the same when we have evidence and when we try to make decisions in life sciences is that we know the data are imperfect. So just how imperfect are they, and what do we feel confident with? Song, I'd be curious about your thoughts too. When we start defining these things around rigor, or transparency, or explainability, what do those mean for you?
I think that there are a couple of emerging checklists. I think those are practical tools we can use, like Elevate Gen AI. I think it was published by ISPO Working Group, and also tools like Cheers AI, Prisma Trees. Those are the checklists we can use to really make sure the most important elements are there. For methodological transparency, I think it requires explicit documentation of the model's name, version, developer, like release date, architecture, whether it's open source or not. Source traceability, I think, it mandates clear disclosure of the training data, data source, fine tuning details, and whether the use of a technique like RAG, retrieval augmented generation, to ground outputs in verifiable external documents or patient EHR. I think those are very important. And also, reproducibility requires vendors to share exact prompt wording, query phrasing, and also reproducible codes or deployment configuration. Because I think many manufacturers like Takeda, they start to deploy those tools inside their system. So this is also important. HTA agency also requires proof of compliance with data protection laws, copyright license, and human-in-the-loop oversight for producibility principle. And talking about real-world evidence as example, under the new framework like UK NICE real-world evidence guidance, it is non-negotiable to document exact how the unstructured data are processed and transformed into structured variables. You must see results of solid assessment and validation studies for the methods used to derive that data. And there must be audit-ready documentation that transparently explains data, like you said, explainability, right? The data provenance and links the source data directly to the analytic data set.
Thank you for sharing. And so, Mark, kind of going to you now, I'm curious, based on what you're hearing, what you see kind of two key stakeholders that are making decisions and are hoping to use evidence from these tools. What do you think the models that you're building and we're building in the field can actually commit to? What do you think are the limits of what we're creating? And is it possible to kind of meet these different benchmarks and these expectations?
Yeah, absolutely. What I love about this question is that commitment is in many ways, at the heart of what it means to define a product and say, this is what my product does, and also this is what it doesn't do. And so for me, many of these questions are about trust, right? If I go back to an example from now 25 years ago when Google search came around and became the dominant search engine, right? Before Google search, there was lots of search engines and they worked reasonably fine, but they somehow lacked in a certain trust, essentially, right? I can type in what I'm asking for, and maybe actually, I don't know if some of you did this, but you would go to different search engines to see how you would collect all the information in one place. And Google's algorithm did something magical, which caused very rapidly caused most of us, I would say, to suddenly believe like, okay, when I put in my queries in Google, it comes out the right way. I trust it. This is what I'm looking for. And you sort of co-evolve with the software that's being developed. And so it's interesting to ask a question, was Google 25 years ago more transparent than other search engines? Was it able to commit to something more? Or at some level, is it simply that it nailed this trust question really, really well, and it was able to answer the questions that people were really asking for? So for me, obviously, that's the latter. Algorithmic improvements meant higher quality, but also it was how it was presented. It was how it allowed the user to interact with the data to figure out whether they had the right thing or not. So I really like Song's point about reproducing an exact prompt, because I want to take this in a different direction and say a good piece of software allows me to ask the question in different ways. And if it's always coming out the same way because it's the same answer, that's going to create trust, right? So I don't want to be limited in how I interact with the software. I want to be able to try things out. So that to me is the most important thing a model needs to commit to. It's to be able to say, as you, I'm going to try to do my best to understand your intent and allow you to explore the space of answers I can give to you. And we're going to do this in a dialogue that creates that trust, that creates that transparency. I understand how you're coming to these answers. And facts and citations are the bedrock of this. But I think by virtue of what we're asking these systems to do, we need to go much further, right? I'm asking it to conclude. I'm asking it to combine facts. So that's really, I think, where we want our models to commit today.
Thank you, Mark. And I think maybe we'll expand on that a little bit more. So we know that generative AI by design is non-deterministic. So some of the things we talked about is that reproducibility part. So we know that when we run the same evidence synthesis twice, you may get different outputs. This we know is not a bug, but intrinsically it's a problem when outputs feed into regulatory submissions and clinical strategy decisions are quite different. So how are you as a builder architecting around this? And then Faisal and Song, as a vendor, when a vendor tells you they've solved for consistent and auditability, what does that proof actually look like? So I'll have you, Mark, start there. And how do we navigate that non-deterministic kind of component of the AI we're using?
Absolutely. I love that question because it's exactly that tension between software and human, where, if I ask 10 different experts in AI a specific question, they will give me 10 different answers. But I'm very comfortable with that fact. And actually, what that means is most of my workflows do involve polling different experts, understanding their biases, understanding their sources, and then pulling them together is what I need to do. With generative AI, what's fascinating is because it is software and because we can rerun it with exactly the same prompt, there is an expectation, and correctly so, that should give me the same answer. It should be consistent. I do see that we've become much better at this. Most of the modeling improvements we've seen in the last 2 years are actually, in many ways, saying, I can ask my question in many different ways and get an answer that is consistent with what I'm looking for, right? The biggest challenge that I see today when it comes to non-determinism is not so much in terms of the output that the system will give us, because I think we control this reasonably well, but it's actually what's called the alignment problem, meaning if my question is fundamentally ambiguous because I left out information, and maybe I think you should know that information, but there's no way you could. How do we resolve this, right? How do we actually inform the user that their question was ambiguous, or the question has multiple answers, or the question is ill-defined? And at the end of the day, one solution is to surface the assumptions we're going to make. But again, how do we decide together interactively whether we've made the right assumptions?
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah.
Faisal or Song, Song, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with Mark. I also like to share what I have observed, as in pharma industry, from manufacturer perspective. I think it's been a trend that manufacturers tend to spend more and investing into the space that may represent very niche, label niche indication, because it's like competition where it's you know, relatively easier to articulate the value story, but it's actually our less, perhaps a less understood area. And I think that related to the model builder to train the model and make sure the model uh, being trusted, and that trust relies on the domain specific grounding, like the disease knowledge, or all those very, very um, fundamental infrastructure. Because AI is a probabilistic, sorry, and it will vary the outcomes. So I think to solve the inherent non-determinism of generative AI, I think builder must architect system that can enforce consistency and traceability, right? So, and it's RAG should be used primarily. That combines large language model with structured databases queries to support evidence traceability and citation integrity. So, and when a vendor come to me that saying they have solved this auditability issue, I think the proof should be look like a agentic architecture that transparently flags whether the extracted information was explicit, inferred, or missing, that allowing human to easily review the logic and seek the original source documentation. So to me, I think it's more relevant.
Yeah, not a huge amount to add from my perspective. I think speaking from the ultimate goal of what we're trying to do, which is to try and create new treatments or medicines for patients, at the absolute level, at the patient-facing side, as a physician, you know every patient is an experiment in themselves. There's no expectation that that patient is going to react or have a performance or outcome, even at the average of the average outcomes that we have within the clinical studies and research. So variation is fine. Physicians and surgeons deal with variations and variability all the time, but they're used to it. But it's really the lack of auditability and explainability and version control is really important. To give you an example, I was involved in creating a nomograms for patients with end-stage cancer, certain types of cancers, renal cancer and liver mets, etc. And people were very worried that we were going to say, well, if you've got these baseline clinical characteristics or biochemical characteristics, if you take this medicine, your progression-free survival or survival will be X. Actually, that's not what we were saying. We built it to say, if you've got these baseline characteristics, and if you've got these clinical biochemical characteristics, based on our clinical data set, your probability of being progression-free or survival or being survival at 12 months is X%. So suddenly that changes the frame of how you're looking at what these models are trying to do or what they're trying to say, from a more probabilistic model to actually a deterministic. So I think these can be solved, and physicians and surgeons are used to it, treating at the point of the patient. Yeah.
Thank you. Sangha or Mark, any thoughts on this at all? Or would like to elaborate? I think I want to go through to, I think, Faisal and Song a bit more. So we've been talking a lot about, okay, what do we require? But I think I'd be curious for you, at what point would you start using these AI tools? Is it when it's significantly faster, when you know that it is 95+% accurate? What are kind of the key indicators for you of when it makes sense to start using these tools? So Faisal, I'll get you to start, and then Song, I would be curious on your thoughts.
Sure. I suppose the key point is, what 5% are we talking about, right? And what is that 5% error rate? Is it around formatting or sequencing of information? Or is it that 5% of the time we're missing key clinical trials as we benchmarks against like Cochrane or SLRs, etc., or misinterpreting subgroups. The latter is really hard to take, and that would be unacceptable at the 5% level. The former would be more than acceptable. This is what we kind of use to. So I think understanding what that 5% is really important. In normal clinical practice, we are used to looking at bodies of evidence, right? And we say that so if there's an issue with the patient and the patient says, I got this treatment, I should have got that treatment, the physician only has to show that there's a body of evidence that supports their way of treating that patient with those characteristics. And so really understanding if within that 95% envelope that you mentioned, there's that body of evidence is within that and is comforting that, or that's being excluded. I think that is really, really, really important, because ultimately what we're trying to do is the model supporting and justifying appropriate integration of that medicine within the treatment pathway. Because ultimately what we may end up doing is either excluding patients who could have benefited from the treatment, or including patients who are getting marginal benefit or little benefit, and they're not getting the benefit of other treatments. And both, we want to avoid both within the clinical development perspective as well as the commercialization perspective. And I think this is where these models are really going to help us quite dramatically to kind of generalize in a really pragmatic way how to commercialize these medicines. And hopefully if that 5% is mostly the formatting piece and not the subgroups of clinical trials, will get there.
For sure. And I guess too, just as well, what is your expectations around speed now that we're introducing AI? So definitely we want to make sure, again, we're not missing those things that are very important, that we're able to audit it, that we're able to have that explainability. But what are your expectations of, again, maybe AI increasing, how quickly we can get results? And then I guess that trade-off with what are you okay with, I guess, being missing or not complete?
Yeah, I think more and more as we've got used to all the new models that have come out and commercially available models, people have quickly realized that speed, just because something is quick doesn't mean it's been done in an inappropriate, dirty way. People have now understood huge amounts of information can be digested and scoured and summarized very, very quickly. Whereas if this was happening with traditional models or traditional ways of working, people get very, very worried. So I think that is becoming, it's going to be less of an issue. I think what's going to be more an issue is how quickly we got to put, for example, as someone said, the prompt together. How quickly do we define the question? Really defining the question, articulating what is the problem that we want to solve, and spending more time on that rather than what we know will happen very quickly. I think that is going to be maybe where most of the scrutiny is going to be on.
Thank you. So yeah, so I'm hearing a lot more onto the rigor part. And I know as a researcher, a lot of times half the battle is defining what it is you're focusing on. May it be the indication, the scope, the timelines, the population. So I hear you on that. Song, what are your thoughts?
I can share a recent experience. We at Takeda, we try to bring the AI-based solutions inside and to address of literature review needs, and I think that kind of make me think, what is the efficiency gain of automation, right? By accepting unknown error rate, because this is not like 100% accuracy, right? I think it's a key learning for me is around the workflow, because like I said earlier, the three principles of evidence being trusted, rigor, transparency, and replicability. It's actually does not matter whether we use AI or not, right? The principle of evidence being trusted never change. So to me, when we use AI tool to help us daily work, I think, like I said, workflow is sometimes overlooked. And my experience is, for example, in systematic literature review, when we see a tool that can design workflow intentionally by separating sensitivity from specificity. I think it means that AI is programmed to act as a highly inclusive initial filter. This is what we need, right? We need it maximize sensitivity to reduce false negative while pushing specificity and final exclusion criteria or decision downstream for human review. So to me, this is an exercise that known error rate is safely mitigated.
Thank you for sharing. And I appreciate you acknowledging that what Cochrane puts forth should not just be for AI, that it should be everything that we're doing.
Yeah.
And Mark, so I'd be interested from your side, you're hearing what our life science experts are wanting and are interested in. How do you think this reflects to what you're building or how you're building right now in the life sciences space?
Absolutely. I love Song's point about and Faisal's point about the not all errors are created equal, right? Like if you're building a self-driving software, a fatality is a much more serious error than maybe the comfort of the person in the car. And we want to acknowledge this and manage this essentially in the software we build. So the good news is, I'm a reinforcement learning researcher. I've been working on this for over 20 years now. And the other name for reinforcement learning is decision making under uncertainty. How do you make the right decisions when things are uncertain? And so at the heart of what we're building at Reliant is exactly this question of how do you manage the different costs of errors and create the right software for this. I'll give a very concrete example, right? Actually drawn from literature review that Song was mentioning. We learned early on as we're building this out that if I ask an AI for screening abstracts and I'm only allowed to say yes or no, that is likely to go wrong either way because of everything we've talked about today, user alignment errors, ambiguity, uncertainty. And so what we've actually done is design a system where the AI could also say, look, given what you've asked me, the cost of error, of course, this is in the context of screening, not self-driving, but the cost of error is too high, so I'm going to defer it back to you, right? And I think this is what I'm very excited about personally, is to open the box, allow our AI to do things that are not just giving an answer in order to mitigate the risk of errors, manage costs. And then there's absolutely a lot of things we could be doing here. So to me, this is the future of AI usage, is something that's human in the loop, interactive, and understand the consequences of different kinds of errors very acutely.
Thank you for sharing, Mark. I really value that perspective. Any thoughts, Hazel or Song, on what Mark said? And I think maybe we continue on a bit more of we really want to move towards that human-led AI assisted. What does that mean for you? And I guess you ever see a world where that changes? Or you would feel confident in allowing AI to kind of take the wheel on more things?
Yeah, I think it must represent a human at the driver's seat workflow, where AI acts as a central instrument, but is formally guided by human expertise and governance. Yeah. Because to me, the AI-led workflows, they need to be appropriate um, because they must demonstrate that AI does not autonomously make definitive changes to, for example, EHR data. Using AI in evidence generation, I think it's there are many use cases that AI to process EHR data, unstructured data, right? So instead, AI should suggest, flag, or prioritize changes for human review based on the clear SOPs before feeding those into high-stake decisions. This workflow must provide line-by-line explanation of AI decision-making process, and I think this is called explainability, right? And disclose the training data, characteristics, and report formal agreement statistic between human and AI workflows.
Thank you. Faisal, what are
Yeah,
your thoughts?
yeah. I mean, I think just to add to that, I think what is really, really important, and which is the kind of the elephant in the room, is we need to make sure that human verification is real and not just a rubber stamp exercise. And for that to happen, we need to make sure there are people with time to do it, right? There are people who know how to do it, and people who know what to look for in this new world where these models are looking at that. And I think I see this as an important parallel in terms of the evolution of surgery. Before you had open surgery, people were trained on open surgery. People had a lot of experience and a lot of doing open surgery and managing complications of patients when they had open surgery. Then when laparoscopic surgery started to come in, those people who first started to use laparoscopic surgery, if there was an issue with the patient where you only have a very narrow access and you have, just a few kind of cameras pointing in and, not a large incision, if something would go wrong, they were able to convert into an open surgery because they'd done 1,000 of them before. The new generation surgeons have coming through, and they've done very few, if any, open surgeries. So when things go wrong, they don't know how to do that, right? So very quickly, the skills get lost. And now we have robotic assisted surgery, which is going to increase this in an exponential way. And I see something similar happening here for people like me and Song who have done a lot of HEOR work, real world evidence generation, clinical trials work, and when things go wrong, we can spot it. Maybe subliminally we can spot when things are not quite right, and we can look for that clinical context, or this is what obviously what's happened. But I think the issue will be that very quickly skills will be lost, and then people won't know what to look for, and then people will not be or departments won't be resourced to even look for things like this. So I think that is really, really important, because that liability will still be there for whoever's generating these outputs. And at the end of the day, there will be a patient somewhere who will get a medicine or not get a medicine on the back of this. It's really important that this is done correctly and in a way that the liability is just not lost and just transferred over to the models, etc.
I really appreciate you bringing up the need to train and equip, I think, the next generation and researchers now of how to navigate these models. Because like you said, yes, it's great you can get to the answer quicker. I see this with my students. I'm sure, Mark, you do as well. They can get to the answer quicker, but they haven't had those reps. They haven't had that experience digging through the papers the same way. So how do we get individuals to have that depth still, and take advantage of how quickly we can navigate the literature? So I'm curious from there, Faisal and Song, what for you do you think when you are working with AI vendors, what are the 3 questions, say 2 or 3 questions that every team should be asking of the vendors that they're working for?
Song, do you want to go first?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I think perhaps I like to ask how does your system handle data conflict or model degradation over time? Can you provide verifiable time-stamped audit trail for every AI-generated output? How is that model's confidence calibrated to its actual clinical accuracy to avoid any false confidence gap? That may be the question I like to ask.
Thank you. Faisal, how about yourself?
Yeah, I mean, very similar questions. I suppose what's really important for me to understand is show me what evidence has been generated, show where the model doesn't work, or where does it fail, so we can really understand where those limits and envelopes are, so we don't solve one problem and create 3 other problems, right? Because then we drop something else. That is really, really important, because when you get blinded a little bit by the light, you suddenly think this is solving everything. And often it's creating some other problems which can be solved, but if you didn't know they were going to be generated, it may be too late. I think that's really important. Second
So
is,
really, yeah. So awareness of those limitations is what I'm hearing. Just what it is, what it isn't. Yeah.
exactly. Second one is around how does it handle those edge cases or rare evidence,
Mhm.
particularly important in oncology, and rare diseases where I've done a lot of work. Clinical trials, by definition, try to be as homogeneous as possible and controlled. So there's only one variable different between the two arms. So you can pick up a signal and it's not lost in noise. And there's a lot of architecture and infrastructure surrounding those patients as they go through clinical trials to make sure they're adhering, to make sure any adverse events are picked up very earlier on and managed, etc. Once the drug's approved and put out there in the market, patient comes in, diagnosed, get given a bunch of pills and see you in 3 months, right? And then it's a and we wonder why the outcomes are very different. And which is why often claims data that we see, it looks very different in terms of the patients who receive the medicines, their outcomes, their adverse events, to patients who are enrolled in clinical studies. And in clinical studies, often companies will do the experiments where we know we have a good chance of success because we know that's where we need to invest our resources. These experiments are designed in a certain way to maximize the chance of success by focusing, as someone was saying, on a patient population where we know we've seen the greatest signal. But in the real world, often other patients will get the treatment. How will your model account for that? Because everyone will be looking for that. Because more and more what's going to happen, of course, is clinical studies will get smaller and smaller. The amount of clinical controlled evidence that we will get will be smaller at the time of regulatory approval. We'll be in a situation of 10 patient proof of concept studies, 50 patient approval studies, maybe not even controlled. And the real experimentation will happen in the real world. How will these models cope with that? I think that's going to be important. And the last piece, which we talked about before, is auditing the outputs end to end. Really need that line of sight of where all these claims are coming from, and can we link it all up together, or is there in different parts of black box? Really, really important to have that.
No, thank you
Yeah,
for
I fully
sharing.
agree with Fazil. I also like to add one question. That is something I did not ask at start with integrate and interacting with the vendor, but afterward I realized this is should be the question I ask at first, which is because we often accept what vendor claims, like 70% or 90% time savings, right, by using AI, but we never actually calculating the substantial human efforts needed to prepare, to set up, right? Those things I think are important. So I like to ask how much manual quality check and training time is actually required to achieve the advertised efficiency gain, at the very start by when interacting with the vendor. So I think that's something we as an organization should ask as we progress into a transformed like AI based organization.
Yeah, so really, what are the human resources needed? No, I appreciate it. Both
Yeah.
of your questions are fantastic, and I think it's on a lot of important items that are necessary. Mark, I'm curious from your side, what is a question you wish your customers were asking you? So we've heard great ones that have come up from our two life sciences leaders, but I'm curious, what do you think they're still missing, or what do you wish you had in more information as you're building?
What I see is it's day and night from what it was 2 or 3 years ago in terms of as a field, both as AI users and as AI makers, we now much better understand um, where these systems work and where they don't. For example, everything we're asking around evidence, I think we've learned the hard way that you can't just take what's coming out of ChatGPT for granted. And of course, right? And so we've built great muscle memory, I think, now around AI tooling. The most important thing for me that I like to ask vendors is, what are your expectations? And in many ways, the question I'd love to hear back is, what can your software, how perfect or imperfect is your software, and how do I work within that imperfection, right? Help me figure out, because the biggest challenge we have today is to really unlock the value, the full value of AI software. We do have to change our workflows in some places. We're still trying to figure out where that is and where that isn't. Um, and so that's the question for me that's the most important is how if I'm a vendor, how should I use this, right? How is it going to complement what I'm doing already, and how should I use it? And the reason why this matters so much to me is if we want to see the future of AI software If we want to see how it's going to be for life sciences, I think in a few years, we can look at AI coding, which is at the forefront of the AI revolution. And you can look at things like the Wild West, like OpenClaw, and you can tell that there's a lot of capabilities we're not tapping into yet because we haven't figured out how to use the software to make it work for us. So that's the most important question for me. How will I use the software and how will it make me happy?
Thank you for sharing. I appreciate that. So we got one question left before we'll go to the audience, but one way to wrap it up. So as an AI generated evidence package, let's say it feeds a market access submission. It gets through, but then a year later, the reimbursement decision gets challenged and the evidence doesn't hold. Who is held accountable? So when we use evidence that we thought were right, who is accountable here and how do we navigate the vendor, the HUR team, the medical affairs function that signed off, or the model itself? So be curious. Maybe Song, we'll start with you. What do you think? Who is accountable when it goes wrong?
I think it's the AI model. I'm kidding. No, it's never AI model itself. I think it's always the accountability always resides with the human users and submitting organization. In the case of like reimbursement or HTA submissions, and it's actually requires organizations like Takeda, either HUR or medical affairs team. We must clearly declare the use of AI in the submission, right, and justify the methodological choices and bear full responsibility for the content integrity. And to enforce this, governance framework requires infrastructure that capture verifiable event trees, so organization can trace exactly who authorized, verified, and submitted the AI-assisted evidence.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, ultimately, the accountability will be shared, but it will stay with a human, right? I think often the mistake that we make, mostly because of the user interface that we're now seeing with these models, is that we almost see it as a team member, right? It's not a team member, it's a tool. And like you wouldn't hold another tool accountable for something, you wouldn't hold the model really accountable. It's really the team that's using it, designed it, the function that signed it off within the company to some extent, the vendor who's developed it. But the way I would look at it is that often when we approach these models, we're thinking the approach is often, this is replacing something that we did already to do it quicker and cheaper. Whereas that's not the way I often look at it. I look at it that we can now do more experimentation before taking a choice of doing things that we would have done anyway. Like, for example, with fusion reactors and all the work being done with fusion reactors with very high temperatures, using high quality magnets to keep that fusion, that heat in. A lot of the very complex models that are being created to try and design those reactors, that is done millions and millions and millions of times before that first one is built, because you can try and experiment as much as possible and not try and put all your eggs in one basket with one. I see that's the approach I would take with clinical studies and clinical development and creating a health economic model that we can now build the confidence around the model that we're creating, do it 1,000 times to really build that confidence and not using it as another team member, another tool, and then go ahead and do that experiment or to create that model, etc. So you can outsource that analysis, but you can't really outsource the accountability. So I think that's the way I would look at it.
I appreciate that. Marks, any closing thoughts on that question or anything we discussed about?
Yeah, absolutely. I really like Faisal's point. It's exactly, and this is at the heart of how we think about building software at Reliant as well. We should be using AI today to reduce risk, not simply make things go faster, right? And a good AI product will have this built right in, right? And if that happens, then this reduces the probability of failure somewhere else. And just means that at the end of the day, we should have a smoother path.
Thank you. So we have one question we'll go to here before we wrap up from the audience, and probably more for you, Song and Faisal, but Mark would be interested on your perspective as well. How often should my organization be talking about AI implementation and reviewing our tool lists? Should this be a yearly thing, quarterly, monthly? Be curious from all of your experiences how often that's happening, or how your companies are thinking about different tools.
So,
Yeah, thanks, Fazio. I can share again my experiences within Takeda. We started to provide solutions, AI-based solutions, to our internal users for literature review, and we actually started quarterly feedback so that we collect the feedback from users. The users actually are using multiple AI tools so that we can compare tools against each other, and so that, and also we collect the feedback quarterly, and the goal is actually trying to integrate or deploy the tool that fit into our Takeda system, and we're gonna those feedbacks are gonna inform us what is the best strategy to do the integration, whether it's gonna be one tool to do all the job, or we need to separate the two into like workflow based modules, and then put different modules together. But yeah, I think that's our experience, and so far it works.
Thank you for
Faisal,
sharing.
please.
yeah, I think from my perspective, I don't think we have enough information. This is still a very new field, relatively new field for people in life sciences, at least from a clinical development and medical affairs perspective. I think those days of really cool innovation coming through, and then you have that change curve. You have the early adopters, the fast followers, the late adopters. I think that's really gone out of the window now, right? If you're not an early adopter, then already by the time you press the button, the technology you've used is redundant. So you really need to know at that moment you're pressing the button on that week, this is the best method to use, and having some kind of autonomous system. Maybe this is where agentic AI will come in, will help us make sure and select that at this moment in time that we've done this was the best and most suitable, appropriate, because that may not be true a week later, right? Everything I seem to use gets redundant within a few weeks, and then I have to try and learn something new. But yeah, let's see what happens in the future.
For sure. Thank you. Mark, any closing thoughts?
As Faisal said, the song said, the pace in 2025, the pace of AI was just through the roof. We're going to see the same thing this year. What I do like is I think we're finding a footing in terms of what we expect AI software to look like, what we want it to do. And so for us, and this is how we think about this internally as well as users of AI, it's keeping up with the capabilities, understanding exactly the current capabilities and where they're going, and then creating a roadmap around it, and making sure that we keep up with the growth of capabilities.
Thank you so much. And that brings us to the end of our panel today. I want to thank all of our panelists today for joining us. Thank you for this amazing conversation. Again, it's such a treat to be able to get a couple different perspectives in the room together. I think sometimes it's either heavy clinical or it's heavy on ML. So to get some of these different perspectives and get us on the same page was really enjoyable. So thank you all for joining, spending part of your day with us. A little bit more about Reliant. So we are building, we started Reliant AI because we know the future of high stakes evidence wasn't just about more data, it's about better data connectivity. So our evidence graphs allow you to model commercial success and predict outcomes with a level of precision that was previously out of reach. We believe in keeping the expert in the loop, as we've talked about today. Human is always important, ensuring that your decisions are backed by the world's best data. They're always finalized by the people who know the work best. So again, making sure we have individuals in this field who have the skills and the experience necessary to make those decisions. And the results really are speaking for ourselves. So we had a client recently that achieved a 200x increase in decision-making speed. with the same level of rigor they were having manually. And we built a platform that your team will trust and your users can actually enjoy. So with the expertise of Mark, who we had today, and our entire machine learning team behind every code, we're ready to help you and everyone in our audience here turn your evidence into your greatest competitive advantage. So if you're excited about partnering with our team and will have questions or would like to talk more about some of the ideas that we discussed today, please reach out. And this information will be shared in the upcoming days after this webinar. So thank you. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your week. Take care.